Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi bismillahir rahmanir rahim, and welcome to a new month in which we're having an Ummatics Colloquium on Ummatic pop culture and youth identity. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Kamaludeen Mohamed Nasir to talk about this month's topic on global Ummatic pop culture, as it were. So the global Muslim popular culture is key to identity formation. As many young Muslims are caught between seemingly contesting national, religious, and ethnic identities, we see how they have artfully fostered a third way by cultivating a global popular culture where faith emerges as the foundation of their shared identity. Through art, sports, social media, and digital technology, Muslim youth culture has inspired a global consciousness beyond state borders and national identities. Broader conversations about strengthening solidarity and cultivating third spaces for expressing their shared belief, creativity, and experiences have fostered a youth culture that gives new shape to what it means to be a Muslim youth today. The quote-unquote Ummatic pop culture thrived under a generation that some scholars, including the present, have referred to as the September 11th generation. As the world grows increasingly interconnected with avenues that are with what avenues Muslim youth explore to nurture an Ummatic youth culture, and how these emerging transformations in global Muslim popular culture are informing identities in the Muslim youth worldwide, are questions that we're going to explore in the course of today's discussion. And it gives me great pleasure, as I have mentioned, to welcome Dr. Kamaludeen Mohamed Nasir, who is an Associate Professor of Sociology at Nanyang Technical University in Singapore. I hope I've correctly pronounced the university's name. From 2023 to 2024, he was visiting professor and Malaysia Chair of Islam in Southeast Asia at Georgetown University. His extensive research focuses on the sociology of religion, cultural sociology, and the sociology of youth, with a particular emphasis on how Muslim youth engage with popular culture and navigate their identities within the context of nationalism. Dr. Kamaluddin has authored several influential books, including Globalized Muslim Youth in the Asia Pacific and Representing Islam, Hip Hop of the September 11th Generation, both of which explore the intersections of Muslim youth culture and state policies. He's particularly prolific. I think these are 2 of 5 books that you've written, and he's currently finishing a book called Football and Islam: Negotiating Identity in the Global Game. So welcome, Dr. Kamaluddin. The floor will be yours for the next 40 minutes to present your vision of Ummatic youth culture. And so please you feel free to begin your presentation. I believe there will be some slides. So if we can have the slides shared, and inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you, Dr. Usama, for the kind introduction. Okay, can share my slides now. Thank you again to the Ummatics Institute for inviting me. As mentioned, I'm a sociologist by training, so I'll bring my perspective into to this topic about the Ummatic popular culture and youth identity formation. So basically, my last 4 books have examined the intersections of popular culture, piety, and state management. So we say that the global Muslim popular culture is key to identity formation. How do we make sense of the idea of a global Muslim popular culture? So basically, in this presentation, I will share some of my findings from my studies on Muslim and popular culture, on which I've written a couple of books: Globalized Muslim Youth in the Asia Pacific and Representing Islam, Hip Hop of the September 11 Generation. I like to get some kind of definitions out of the way, so that the audience know that what we are talking about in terms of the definitions, the key definitions of certain key concepts, right? So basically, when we talk about pop culture, which is popular culture, we are talking about, sociologists are referring to sets of practices, beliefs, and objects that embody the most broadly shared meanings of a social system. So this can manifest itself in in the form of media objects, in the form of entertainment, and leisure, fashion trends, and linguistic conventions. So these are some of the things that I will broach during my presentation. And some key issues that sociologists usually broach when studying popular culture is the representation of particular groups and themes, like how are particular groups represented in particular popular culture. For example, you have seen famous studies of how Muslims are represented in Hollywood movies, for example. And sociologists also look at the role of cultural production as a form of social reproduction, like how having the knowledge of particular cultural scene advantages certain groups. For example, we are one of the famous studies of this is Pierre Bourdieu's book called Distinction, and on how the custodians of a particular culture kind of like socially reproduce themselves and advance themselves in certain scenes. And one other issue that of sociological analysis is how audiences exercise agency in determining the meanings of the culture that they consume. So this is where most of my work mainly lies, right? On how the consumers of popular culture and the custodian and the people who practice this popular culture, and what kind of agency do they bring in, the kind of meanings, and how they appropriate it for their own beliefs and for their own kind of like activism, for example. And how are these popular cultural practices global? So globalizing forces come with the digital age, right? Some may argue that Islam has always been globalized since the very beginning, since for like 1400 years ago, and so on. All good, and the point is valid. But globalizing forces today come into contact with the digital age, and this is intensified with social media penetration. I think we all can agree on that. The social function of the internet is especially significant for Muslims. For example, it has been mentioned that the application of the internet is having an overarching transformational effect on how Muslims practice Islam, how forms of Islam are represented in the wider world, and how Muslim societies perceive themselves and their peers, right? And important and new issues with no immediate basis in traditional sources can be discussed, right? Like authors such as Gary Bund in his book I, Muslims, and the digital Ummah, for example, he has mentioned this point. So the global nature of popular culture is also driven by solidarity movements. So, and in this is an identity marker for urban minority youth, and it can also be conflated with ethnic pride. Right? Sometimes like particular ethnic groups which are marginalized in particular localities, like conflate their identity with certain kinds of popular culture. The other driver for global movement is actually generational ties, and I will go deeper into this like over the next few slides. So September 11 generation, right? One way young Muslims across national borders today can be conceptualized is through the idea of generations. Studying generations enable us to explore Ummatic trends across age groups. Like we all know Huntington's famous Clash of Civilizations thesis. It has been revitalized and extended to include, since September 11, the stigmatization of an emergent generation of young Muslims. So moral panic and fear of young Muslims have come to define an entire generation. So contrary to the previous generation of their parents, this unique generation has not known anything other than intense securitization, hyper-securitization, be it in Muslim or non-Muslim majority countries. So we have, if we tap into like classical sociologists, for example, Hungarian sociologist Karl Mannheim, who studies the sociology of generations. So basically, he says that members of a generation galvanize and mobilize themselves by the experience of historical events from similar vantage points and are exposed to similar traumatic experiences. And more contemporary kind of sociologists develop this. People like Brian Turner and June Edmonds argue that generations identify themselves in terms of historical and cultural traumas, which are produced by a diversity of social processes, right? But what is interesting about the sociology of generations is that it does not stop there. Is that these generations can influence society by challenging conventional norms and offering new cultural visions. So when we talk about, these are some manifestations of the Muslim popular culture that we see today. So it can come in the form of like a dress code. The most common manifestation is Muslim streetwear. So some brands are more short-lived than others, and some with more longevity. When I was living in Sydney like about a decade ago, there was this brand called the gear, right? Where youth literally wear their identity on their sleeves, right? This is also integrated with other forms of popular culture, like the ones I will be discussing today, hip hop culture, the consumption of football, or in the US, you all call it soccer, and also a new form of like a consumer ethic. Right? So, what makes these popular cultural practices Muslim is not just that Muslims are fronting them, but the explicit Muslim cause or messages they contain. So basically, I reread some of my works for the purposes of this talk and realized that both consciously and subconsciously, the idea of the Ummah has been central to my writings. In the two books that I show here, Globalized Muslim Youth and also Representing Islam, the word Ummah featured quite prominently. It was mentioned about 40 times in Globalized Muslim Youth and about 60 times in Representing Islam. There were several terms of references that I've used to refer to Muslim youth collectives in both books, such as the Digital Ummah, Poetic Jihadis, Hip Hop Activists, and I've also done with a colleague of mine in the sociology department, the study of like Muslim girl culture, or the hijabista or hijabster movement. So if you look at other academic works, right, when you talk about the hip hop fraternity, right, the word Ummah has also been used. So you look here, as you can see on the screen, some works that have been academic works that have been published from 2004 to 2006, alluding to the hip hop Ummah. Although some scholars argue that the term Ummah in traditional terms, which goes back to the constitution of Medina, what has been termed sometimes as the Ummah document during the time of the Prophet Muhammad SAW, refers to a larger community of people which might include non-Muslims. The contemporary conception of the Ummah in popular culture at least refers to different pockets of globalized Muslims, right? Or in this the case, the purposes of this presentation, young Muslim collectives and their practices. So, in order to fully appreciate the complexities of Muslim popular culture, right, and the global conversations within the Ummah, my works have called for a provincializing of Islam. Right? After all, there has always been regional and denominational differences in the practice of Islam. So the practice of popular culture is even more dynamic. So the concept of provincialization, right, comes about from another scholar, Dipesh Chakrabarty, in his famous work Provincializing Europe, right, who, when he argues that European thought, while indispensable, is inadequate for understanding the experiences of political modernity in non-Western countries. So so taking, like, for example, just a geographical region as just a province, right, and acknowledging that there are various matrices and nodes of power allows us to bring more kind of like conversations into the fold. So it allows us to challenge center-periphery relationships, between, like, for example, Middle East Islam and Islam from the rest of the world, issues of authenticity, which Islam is more authentic, and looking at the issue from, like, for example, like, as if there's a one-way traffic cultural flow from one region to the next. So the nodes of influence in the modern world are increasingly proliferated, although we should not ignore the relationships of power in the globalization of culture, and these configurations are shifting. Like, gone are the days where Muslims all over the world, by and large, look to just the Middle East as a source of like authentic Islam. So provincializing Muslim practices from the Middle East is especially pertinent because the largest populations by country are not in the Middle East. As you can see from the list that is on the screen, that is provided by the World Population Review. So topping the list is the Republic of Indonesia, an Asian and Oceanic country, that is the fourth most populous country in the world, owing to its 277 million population. So as you can see from the data, like in 2010, people under 30 comprise of 60% of the population in Muslim majority countries and so on. So Muslims, young Muslims are very influential in a lot of these countries, and a significant kind of like a block that and a force that should be reckoned with. So, for example, in Indonesia, the voting age for is 17 years old, and this is also a significant point because this means theoretically their youth are there are in a position to influence political change in the country. So it is also important for us. I do comparative work, right? Do comparative sociology, global sociology. But even so, for example, it is important for us to look at the peculiarities and the specificities of particular countries. So, for example, this is the Indonesian Millennial Report of 2022, which has defined millennials as those belonging to the 20 to 35 years of age. So I just want you to look at and eyeball what are their top concerns, the top concerns of the young people. For example, 85%, like saving money or funds for future needs, making my parents happy, 78%, becoming more religious, 72%, helping other people, 70%, and so on. So sometimes when we talk about youth, like and we listen to global surveys, we have a particular kind of like imagination of youth as being a homogeneous block whereby they are all kind of like desecularized, they don't care about religion anymore, they are all adopting, for example, liberal views and all that. So it is also important to contextualize it within particular countries and within Muslim social groups. So this is another kind of like article that I've recently written, like I think 2-3 years ago, on Muslim consumer ethic, right? On Islamic revivalism and the Muslim consumer ethic thesis. So basically, I talk about how, for example, young Muslims today, they are going beyond like an understanding of basic halal consciousness, right? So from halal products to marketplace to a global Islamic economy. And another study like that I've looked at is the issue of boycotts as moral protest. So I published like in 2016 an article in International Sociology, if some of you are interested, to find out more how boycotts are framed as a moral protest. So the case study that I looked at here was the Israel-Gaza conflict of 2014 and how that has spurred boycott movements in Southeast Asia. So although Muslim youth engage in various forms of resistance as a result of their critical disposition, this topic of consumer boycott is apt due to various reasons. First, it illuminates the tensions young Muslims go through in reconciling their piety with mainstream youth culture. Second, it teases out the various responses and discourses that underpin the youth's concerns surrounding the negative light being cast on Muslims in the post-September 11 era. Third, it highlights the interweaving of the local and global, both at the level of state sanctions and in the attempts of young Muslims to reconcile their loyalty to the global ummah and their nationalistic identity. Okay, my presentation on Muslim hip-hop is going to be the longest of the three forms of popular culture that I'll be talking about today. So, as we all, some of us are aware, for example, there's always been discussions, for example, of reality hip-hop, like social conscious hip-hop as being representative of like messages from the ground. Right? For example, it has been mentioned by Chuck D from Public Enemy that rap music is black folks CNN. Right? So there are a prominent scholar of like a hip hop culture, I think in his book called The Hip Hop Generation, Bakara Kitwani, he has correctly observed that the main driving forces behind the hip hop generation are also the primary, what I will think are the primary factors fueling the homological imagination in the hip hop ummah, right? The advent of globalization, the continued visibility of Black youth in popular culture, the media representations of Black youth that resonate with the sense of alienation felt by young Muslims, which is further reinforced by what is perceived as a prejudiced criminal justice system, both national and international, and the concerns of living in an age of Islamophobia. Right? So, a point that I want to bring across that I feel is important here is that, however, if we were to take on a reductionist approach in understanding the youth consumption of hip hop as basically a form of Americanization, I think it will be to lose sight of the global conversations within the hip hop ummah itself. Right? Although it might be rather convenient to reduce the influence of hip hop ummah among the Muslim youth, for example, in the Asia Pacific to the African American experience, because of the full spectrum of hip hop that is displayed in the public sphere, the same yardstick can also be applied like anywhere else. Right? But the youth are also kind of like contextualizing a lot of the hip hop practice that they are conducting to their own kind of local context, their own trying to reconcile their piety with their craft. So one result of this is that one of the foremost issues when I started studying the Muslim hip hop culture was to understand how most of these youth view the position of music in Islam. Right? For example, the form of music, as we know, that is most agreeable to many Islamic scholars would be the nasheed, right? An Islamic-oriented musical piece that is traditionally sung a cappella and performed with basic percussion. However, within the nasheed genre of music, the permissibility of the female voice is also traditionally sanctioned. Yeah. So just now I was talking about reconciling music and Islam, right? So there has been debates within the hip hop fraternity with regard to the contestation between the terms, whether it should be Muslim hip hop or Islamic hip hop, and how Islamic hip hop serves as a conciliation between Islamic provisions and music. So Islamic hip hop, the types of musical instruments used, expletives, the using of like vulgarities, and frequently refer to issues of doctrine. Muslim simply mean hip hop advanced by Muslim people, right? So with the incorporation of a nasheed element in hip hop, exemplified by the splitting of the body during performances, Muslim youth have become sympathetic towards hip hop groups, even among those who have previously regarded music to be haram. Like, one of the fieldwork that I did, if you look at the screen on your top right, like this is a Muslim day in Manhattan in my family. Look at the crowd, which is like mostly families, like of all walks of life. Like if you look at this slide, and my kid, like in 2013, 16, 17 years old now, he's the one who can carry me now with like this is me with like the native Dean and Asim Suji in on Muslim. You can see a glimpse of what that I'm talking about here. So one aspect of it that attracts Muslims to hip hop is that hip hop culture is a form of empowerment, appropriation of the hip hop. Right? There's an element that practitioners can right? And all kinds of symbolism contextualized by different groups. A lot of books, for example, have spoken about how, for example, the African hip hop and how hip hop used as a potent kind of platform in order to advance social activism, and young Muslims all over the world recognize this, and they have to this their activism. So this transform concerns surrounding Muslim hip hop artists surrounding civil rights and exalted discussion, right? Malcolm X, the concept that for right extends beyond you witness even the Muslim talking about issues, social issues like death, who is also known as Yasin, talking about victims, the about helping. This is another. This is like a one of his interviews, and we're that if his interest the youngest admin rights, this speaking out against wherever, right? Me, or Czechia, or even in countries generally. And this elevation of the discourse from civil rights to human rights is also basically enshrined in this in the speech of Malcolm X, whereby he said that it is not a problem of civil rights, but a problem of human rights. So it is becoming clear that Muslim rappers are increasingly delivering global messages with universal applicability that address non-Muslim issues as well as those affecting the Muslim Ummah. In so doing, young Muslim hip-hoppers are able to transcend their personal troubles and locate themselves within a larger global context. So if you look at, for example, Muslim youth, right, and Muslim hip hoppers, and they are not just like what we can. In my book, I've talked about them and classified them as poetic jihadis, and another famous hip hop scholar, Sami Alim, has discussed them as verbal mujahidins, right? But if you look at hip-hop groups like the Brotherhood, they also engage in operationalizing Islam, right? For example, they perform in free Gaza concerts for the benefit of Palestinians, in addition to like raising funds, right? And there are many hip-hop groups that have at least one pro-Palestinian track. For example, we have the Brotherhood with their song, the pro-Palestinian track Act on It, the Palestinian American duo, and the song Free Palestine, for example, is the title of like a few hip hop outfits. So and you can look at one of these books that I like by David McDonald, which talks about activism in Palestine. The title is called "My Voice Is My Weapon." Right? So how music is intrinsic in the resistance of the Palestinians. So in my book, Representing Islam, so I kind of like use the word represent, right, in a kind of like in two ways. Firstly, Muslims are trying to represent Islam. They represent Islam. You say represent is a popular hip hop jargon, right? To represent mean to front a cause, to champion a cause, to wanting to carry the flag, right? To represent Islam. So I discuss about who can represent Islam, how is Islam represented, can musicians represent Islam, but also in the book I talk about how young Muslims in the course of representing Islam is also representing Islam in new ways, and this is also a response to what sociologists have called living in a crisis of in an age that is characterized by a crisis of religious authority, an age that is characterized by a rise of digital religion, and also an attempt by young people to reconcile their craft with personal piety. So you can see, for example, many hip-hop documentaries have been produced post-September 11 that provide an insight into how young Muslims are grappling with their everyday lives and using music not just as an outlet to vent their frustrations, but also as a platform to effect social change. So this appropriation of like a popular culture, right? Maybe like in this case, the case study here is like hip hop culture, has led to a kind of like young Muslims being able to embody a kind of like cool Islam. So this idea of the Muslim cool has been studied quite a bit within scholarly literature. So one of these conversations that I want to talk about here in this slide is this projection of cool Islam. So this is the cover of a book by Suad Abdul Khabir, in which she wrote about the Muslim cool as a way of being Muslim that draws on blackness to challenge white supremacy and the anti-blackness found in the Arab and South Asian US Muslim communities. So as a researcher, for example, it's imperative for me to take new media very seriously, since using merely national or mainstream media as a source of data does not paint a complete picture of hip-hop culture in many countries. Therefore, I have to study all forms of groups within the Muslim hip-hop fraternity vying to for the attention and support of the Muslim collective. So, for example, there are various groups that have been mentioned, even in, for example, Maya and Kaira's like a study on the Muslim cool in 2008, whereby they mentioned, for example, groups like the Soldiers of Allah, like from the United States, from Los Angeles, and how they gain prominence, especially post September 11, with their narratives, vis-a-vis groups like the Native Deans, like a more spiritual, developmental, and personal political message. So in this sense, cool Islam is envisioned as a protest culture, anti-establishment and innovative ways of reading religion into everyday lives resonate with the young and corroborate the many surveys of millennials that point toward a more open, liberal and participatory form of piety. However, behind the liberal and open-minded mindedness does not mean Muslims are leaving the teachings of Islam behind. On the contrary, it points to the increasing acceptance of plurality within the Ummah and of various kind of interpretations of the Deen. For example, the word Deen itself has been used when we look at various hip-hop groups like Native Deen, Deen Squad, the Mujahideen team. The word Deen is very prominent in the imagination of like a lot of like hip-hoppers. So I'll run along a little bit because I think that I'm running behind time. But studying, for example, popular culture also allows one to broach the study of like to broach the topic of gender. I think this is an important topic. So in one of the chapters of my book, Representing Islam, I have a chapter that talks about the hip-hop hijabis and how sometimes even Muslim males representing women in Muslim hip-hop get into some kind of a wrangle and get sometimes misrepresent women in another way, and how the difficulties of like being a lady kind of like operating within this like a hyper masculine scene can also be something that is quite a challenge for women folk. So the hip hop ummah, right? So in an industry that is like that places a premium on charisma and individual. So there's some kind of tension between when we talk about the hip hop ummah in that sense, because as we understand the musical genre, right? It exalts, it gives a premium on charisma and individual personality. So talking about the ummah itself within the hip hop community can be quite challenging, and this is also a point that some Muslim hip hoppers kind of like bring across. For example, Q-Tip in 1995, whereby he formed a collective simply known as the Ummah. right? And he talks about how, for example, like this becomes a challenge because of what I basically I just mentioned. And before I also want to mention this new project that I've been working on. So what Dr. Usama just now mentioned, I'm currently finishing a book on football and Islam. So we are living, as you know, in an age whereby there are a lot of Muslim elite footballers. So this is the focus of my current project that I have, and it's inshallah going to be released with Oxford University Press next year. Right? So I will share some of the key features of this age of Muslim elite footballers that has driven me to study this topic. For example, the age of Muslim elite footballers is characterized by changing perceptions of Muslims in football by both Muslims and non-Muslims, the shift from the traditional perceptions of Muslim participation in football as a futile activity. Participating in football is traditionally seen as being questionable, and how young Muslims today, like Muslim footballers, are trying to reconcile their piety, like with their craft, in terms of and how young Muslims, for example, are challenging some of these narratives. For example, and even there are studies, for example, published recently in 2021 in the American Political Science Review on the influence. I think this is a famous study on how since the signing of Muhammad Salah, the trend of Islamophobia, in the Liverpool County itself has been decreasing, right? Of course, although this study can be criticized, this is in itself an interesting kind of finding. And then you can see there are other kind of trends, right? There's social media is one of the driving forces that allows Muslim footballers to have greater control over their presentation of self. The global Muslim Ummah now has better insights into the lives of these Muslim footballers. So one of the recent controversies in the football world involves around the resistance against the LGBT movement, right? Or what is seen, for example, the example of Idrissa Gueye, who at that time refused to wear the One Love armband, right? For Paris Saint-Germain during a particular weekend. So, and how Egypt's national player Mustafa Muhammad similarly refused to support the campaign and refused to play a game for his professional club, tweeted on his social media account to also share his perspective, as you can see in the screen grab that I've provided here. Right. So other driving forces include the elite footballers showcasing of their personal piety. Right? Can see a lot of conspicuous religiosity in social media, but it's not just public showcasing of individual piety. It is also a cause of public activism. It's also a cause for doing da'wah and proselytizing for some of these individuals. So here, this is a screenshot of Paul Pogba's post in front of the Kaaba during his Umrah with another kind of another famous footballer, Kurt Zouma. And you can see, for example, in the other picture, how, for example, Masoud Ozil got into a skirmish with his own football club for championing the rights of Uyghur Muslims in China, and how this story develops talking about the erasure of Masoud Ozil from his from Arsenal FC, and how he didn't receive the support after he came out in support of his brethren. So I bring the focus back to the issue of youth identity construction. It is important for us to understand youth identity, because if you want to understand Islam and Muslim societies a few decades from now, you have to understand the youth of today. As we know, people already hold multiple and overlapping identities. You are at the same time a Muslim, as you are American, as you are Arab, and probably a hardcore fan of a soccer team. Hence, it is essential that we unpack these formations and how they guide the actions of young people. So also the youth of today are exposed to a multitude of influences that were never there before. So maybe we can discuss this and talk a little bit more about this during the Q&A section. So as youth negotiate their identities, right, they are also beholden to various loyalties, like between the national, the religious, commercial, generational, and the various stakeholders that are involved, and the various gatekeepers and moral entrepreneurs that are also involved in terms of like governing and socializing young Muslims to socializing them, right? But so seen from the other side of the coin, I just want to before I end off, right, my last few slides, I just want to talk about the burden of being a popular cultural icon, right? Seen from the other side of the coin, not just from the vantage point of consumers of popular culture. Being a Muslim popular cultural icon comes with it a heavy cost, right? You can see like some very popular Muslim like rappers, even like talking about how it has weighed very heavily on their shoulders, being an ambassador for Islam, right, or being seen or perceived as an ambassador of Islam when they speak up for Muslim for other Muslims, and they champion Muslim causes. And recently, if you look at this famous case of like Anwar al-Ghazi, like in the German court ruled that he was unfairly dismissed by his German Bundesliga club Mainz 05 over his social media post about the Israeli genocide in Gaza. So the internet, right, has served a crucial function in the formation of urban moralities, as we all are well aware of. Right? So with the central role of information technology and interfaces, we see an increasing shift to the cyber ummah as the alternative source of religious knowledge. Like in my book that I published with a colleague, with my colleague Sam Han, called Digital Culture and Religion in Asia, we also documented this transformational effect on religions and the religious congregation that does not just affect Muslims. So that book talks about the influence of online religion and religion online from a comparative religion perspective. So it talks about Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, Shintoism, the Falun Gong movement, and how, for example, the internet has has had an overarching kind of like a transformational effect, as Gary Bund, forgive the typo there, is Gary Bund has argued. So this is my second last slide. As much as the overarching process of digitization and urbanization is influencing youth identity formation, my study also points to a magnetic pull of a concept I have termed primordial identity. So this is based on a book that I have written with my former PhD student, Humaira Zainal, 2 years ago, on how Malays in Malaysia and Singapore conceptualize and negotiate their ethnic identity vis-a-vis state constructions of Malay national identity. So basically, in this book, we looked at also mass sources, like we look at popular novels, we look at movies, and how Malay Muslims talk about themselves among themselves, right, in the Malay genre, in the Malay vernacular. And we found out that even in whether it is in Muslim majority Malaysia or Muslim minority Singapore, Islam is the master identity of of Muslims. Islam came off as like kind of like with the most number of hits. If we were to do a discourse analysis and a content analysis of how many times and how deeply these conversations develop, Islam is seen. So there is a kind of like an ummatic or a greater something that is greater than just merely being Malay and so on. So there is an Islamic identity that underpins the identity of a lot of young Muslims, like in contemporary Southeast Asia. So this is so I will end with this slide, right? So one of the strengths of taking on a global or ummatic lens, I would argue, enable researchers to take on a comparative perspective. So when comparing the experiences of young Muslims across countries, one obtains a novel angle from which Muslims can be studied, examining the convergence and divergence of the lived experiences among similar social groups of Muslim youth allows one to deconstruct the myths that reduce social pathologies to particularistic ethnic problems. A comparative framework also highlights the positive and negative features of different models of governance and explains the differences between the specific patterns of behavior that emerge, debunking the notion that a given outcome may be expected in all countries of a similar type. So, in challenging the assumption of center-periphery relationships as espoused by world system theories, for example, it is wise we need to provincialize, for example, traditional places whereby we study Islam and Muslims around the world to include other kind of like a Muslim social groups across different countries. Right? So locating the dilemmas of Muslim youth within a transnational perspective illuminates the complexities of globalization, the nation state, religion, the youth culture in all their complexities. And as I mentioned, this is not only a trend that we see amongst like Muslims. So even though there are strong signs of solidarity within the Muslim Ummah, the Ummah itself has always been diverse. So being monolithic and homogeneous have seldom been the Muslim Ummah's way of describing itself, but rather a caricature given to the Ummah by the West. As I've shown in this presentation, young Muslims resist the simplistic categorizing that has characterized much of the post 9/11 rhetoric that caricatures them into neat dichotomies, and studying popular culture provides the platform for this. Thank you.
Jazakumullah khair, Dr. Kamaludeen. This really has been a fascinating sort of whirlwind tour of popular culture, which obviously you've sort of discussed at length over several books and another forthcoming book, particularly on football, which sounds very interesting, particularly for a European audience. But inshallah, I think now what we will do is we will open the floor for a broader discussion. And inshallah, hopefully the people in the sort of administration in the background can make our pictures equal, because I don't really have necessarily anything to say that is not already in conversation with yourself. So please do, if I could request that both of our pictures are in equal size. Jazakumullah khair. And I look forward to welcoming questions from our audience members. We are, of course, live streaming, so if anyone wants to put questions to Dr. Kamaludeen, then please feel free. But I actually have, this is an area I have found to be of interest for a long time. In many respects, we're all sort of consumers of popular culture by default. And to maybe a more limited extent, even participants. I actually, myself, in my teenage, contributed to a sort of, as a backing vocalist to a munshid, and I used to actually travel with him and serve as a backing vocalist on his sort of nasheed tours. So alhamdulillah, this is something which is, of course, also a very important area of scholarly interest, as you highlighted. And there are a number of scholars who have written in these areas. I think North America actually has been a particularly important place where a lot of this has been explored. So barakallah for that overview. I wanted to actually, so you mentioned a number of questions which are of very great significance, I think, for us to think within the paradigm of Ummatics. And Ummatics as a project is very much thinking about reviving a consciousness that is ummah-wide. Something which, in many respects, popular culture is absolutely instrumental in doing. But of course, there are going to be tendencies in popular culture which are beyond the power of any single entity to control. And also, there will be major players in the space of popular culture. So I think it's probably the case that the United States and India, through Bollywood, are the two major powerhouses globally of producing popular culture that is consumed on a global scale. And in some respects, and so, you talked about hip hop, you kind of alluded to sport, or you are working on sports currently. You alluded to other forms of media, so you did mention film. Of course, literature, there can be popular forms of literature as well, and
Yeah.
increasingly new media, including social media, I think, in which the so-called influencer is, an important figure in popular culture. And I think in all of these sort of arenas, one of the things that we need to bear in mind is, where is the greatest production and where is the greatest monetary value? And I wonder if you could briefly reflect on the implications of the fact that the United States, maybe California in particular, being a center or a hub, whether for technology and the production of social media, and therefore big data and the collection of big data on a scale that is unparalleled in human history, but also a place where you have Hollywood, and Hollywood's relationship with the military-industrial complex is extremely well documented as well. And in addition to that, you have I think the largest and most sort of lucrative sports markets happen to be in the US, although they're very often US centric. But Europe is a major sports market for football in particular, and of course South America. And I wonder if the economics of this, if you can comment on the economic challenge faced by an Ummatic aspiration to become a major player in these arenas, when you have these sorts of resources distributed in over 50 Muslim countries, which are often not political allies, which are maybe sort
Yeah.
of have certain tensions among them, and which are all, in some respects, under the suzerainty of the global hegemony of US political and military might and economic might between the US and China in that particular case. And you can also speak to China's influence, given your own situatedness in Singapore, which is a fascinating sort of US ally, but right in the sort of vicinity of China and Chinese hegemony. So a very broad question to begin with.
Yeah. Thanks, Usama, for starting me off with like a very difficult question. Yeah. Yeah. As I totally kind of like get what you are saying. Like for example, with this hegemonic influence of the Western media, and how the whole world is consuming like news, like from like Western like sources, CNN, BBC, and the influence of Hollywood and stuff like that. There have been many studies on this, right? About how Muslims are being misrepresented, being caricatured, and being reduced to kind of like stereotypical tropes and so on and so forth. Right? But these production houses and military might and this financial kind of like capital is one thing, right? But I also see a lot of like native indigenous efforts being done, right? That we also have to recognize. Like for example, my daughter is like is consuming or subscribing like this like edutainment like from the US. Like Noor Kids, I know a lot of Muslims are aware of it. Like digital content that's like it's been popular around the world, and that we have like examples of this. Like
Right.
Muslims coming together and then banding together. I think the Ummatic solidarity is something that cannot be underestimated, right? Youth have also done a lot with what they have, right? And for example, if you look at the my own study on hip hop culture, on representing Islam, again, we look at how, for example, of the Arab Spring happened, and how, for example, there are a lot of studies that document that how rap and hip hop was the anthem of the Arab Spring, and how protests and social movements and so on are being uh, are being driven by a lot of these like songs and chants, and rappers getting invitations like from one Arab country to come to Tahrir Square in Cairo and so on. So there are a lot of kind of like we live in kind of like a network society now, and
Yeah.
and and this is something that I feel that that young Muslims, like I think they tap on very well. But granted that there are all these like challenges like that have sought like traditionally to to portray kind of Muslims in a less positive way, right? But
Yeah.
there, I see that there is this pushback now.
Right, right. No, I mean that's a more optimistic perspective, and I think optimism is extremely important. I like quoting a particular thinker on the left, Antonio Gramsci, who emphasizes that in a movement against oppression, you have to have pessimism of the intellect, meaning you have to be realistic about like what the world is like, but optimism of the will. So you have to keep pushing.
Yeah.
And I think that's very wise. At the same time, I think um, major sort of like the Pentagon planners, for example, or the state planners for U.S. empire, who are the military budget in the U.S. has a significant allocation to Hollywood sort of like collaboration, or those sorts of pop culture sort of initiatives that might be funded by the State Department in promoting U.S. soft power globally. I think Muslims need to think about those sorts of initiatives as well, but that requires a certain degree of political unification, which major powers globally will do what they can to limit the possibility of. So I think, perhaps a recognition of the power of popular culture is absolutely essential to the maintenance of a certain amount of hegemony on the part of major powers, and Muslims need to respect the fact that popular culture commands that kind of authority, inshallah. I wanted to go to some of the audience questions, inshallah, and I'm going to do my best to filter out. There are a lot of questions for you actually, and you can actually probably see them on your chat as well. But someone's asking, in some respects, a similar question to what I'm asking, and perhaps you can sort of like more specifically answer this question by someone with the name Rahila, who's saying, can Muslims bypass having to go through Hollywood and other mainstream media gatekeepers in order to reach a wider audience?
Okay. I like what you mentioned just now, Usama, about the point about being aware of the influence and the potency of popular culture, right? And if we look at and I've discussed this quite extensively in my book, the West they have like the Hollywoods and whatnot, and the U.S. State Department, they are aware of this potency. So, for example, ever since the Cold War, we've had ping pong diplomacy, we've had jazz diplomacy, and we also have now what hip hop scholars are saying, hip hop diplomacy, right? Whereby, for example, like popular hip hop artists are being sent to the Middle East, to Indonesia, right? In order to kind of like as a form of soft power, right? So until kind of like Muslims are aware and cognizant of what is happening, we are not saying, well, theological debates aside, right? This is but being aware of the social reality of it before we can engage with the social reality of what is happening.
Right.
So we need to be aware before we can engage. But all these things need us to have a certain kind of mindset of what is being done, right? Even before we can tackle. So an understanding of social reality is very important. And there are a lot of, like, for example, if you just now you mentioned to me the question of whether we can bypass Hollywood, right?
Yes.
In terms of like whether Muslims can bypass Hollywood
And other mainstream media gatekeepers in order to reach a wider audience.
Yeah, I basically think that social media has changed the game, right? Social media has basically changed the game in today's. If you look at what is going on now in Gaza, right?
Yeah.
That it is basically a case study of how like mainstream media and all this kind of like a powerful corporations cannot stop, right? Us from viewing, right? All this kind of like content of what is happening, the social reality on the ground, right? And one way, I don't also think that we should look at what is being done in Hollywood, but with critical lens, right? I think that will also inform us in our decisions of what we need to do, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, if I may add to this, I mean, just once again, I don't mean to be like a constant pessimist, but we also need to recognize the significant weakness that arises from the fact that Silicon Valley is in the United States, and the people who are in favor of the genocide of the Gazan people are in control of these sorts of tech companies, these major tech companies. And so there has been a throttling, there's been a reduction of the extent to which the social media feeds do show this sort of data. So you have to very proactively seek it. And even when you share and try and promote it, in the beginning, when there was a lot more sort of reach for these things. So this is another challenge that the Ummah faces, in that since we are sort of divided in this way, we can also be taken down more easily. But at the same time, inshallah, one of the other dimensions of this is not just the United States. The fact that the United States is the biggest market for TikTok, or one of the biggest markets for TikTok, which has, as far as I know, a Singaporean sort of CEO, that also means that TikTok, under pressure from the United States, under the threat of a ban, has also severely limited the reach of sort of Palestinian or Gaza material. And so I think it's really a kind of it's a challenging situation, but it's also one where, as you indicated rightly, social media has been a game changer. It has given access in a way that, just the fact that we are holding this sort of a global event means that we have reach in a way that was unimaginable just maybe 5 years ago, just before the pandemic. We didn't realize that we could do this sort of work. And so, I think in some respects, I wanted to ask you, in connection to that, can you give us some maybe inspiring examples of people who have harnessed social media and then, started from very humble beginnings and made it big in that sort of global space? Does anyone come to mind, or some examples perhaps? Inshallah.
I do not have like a particular kind of example that I can, but there are a lot of today social media influencers, Muslim youth who are social media influencers, like who started off like just like taking a step in the dark, right, on social media, and speaking with a strong voice, right? And they have kind of like managed to change, like make kind of like small grounds in terms of like pushing for some kind of positive change. So the same way, for example, like when I look at some of the hip hop artists that I've like studied, right? Some of them put out their content, right? Their nasheed, for example, on social media, and then after that they get recognized, and then they snowball from there, right? So social media today, I think, like I know that it has a lot of like problems, right? We also experience. We want to limit our kids' kind of like consumption of like social media and so on, and yes, like impact on kind of like mental health, and a lot of studies are also showing that. But yeah, but there are kind of like positives that we can harness as a Muslim community, right? I think if we think strategically about some of this, like we can move some of the agenda forward a little bit.
I should perhaps add just, a kind of disclaimer from an Ummatics perspective. I happen to be like a mufti, but as we speak here, we're not talking about the Shara'i legitimacy or illegitimacy of any of these tools. We're just recognizing that there's broad and diverse range of opinion with respect to a question like music, or indeed sort of the extent to which social media has benefits or harms. But I think what we're asking is the question of how do we harness tools that exist in the public sphere and recognize their importance and their significance, which is what you do in your work. Regardless of, no one's giving a fatwa here that music is halal or music is haram. There are scholars who take both of those positions. And a range of positions in between. I wanted to ask, someone asked a question. Socialization in the past used to be primarily through elders and community, and the community which transmitted knowledge and guidance, etc. In the modern context, we see more peer-oriented socialization. Should an ummatic approach draw on that reality, or is there, what is in a sense lost, and what is gained by recognizing that there is kind of hierarchy of knowledge transmission versus learning from one's peers? Does this make sense?
I think that socialization is still through kind of like a parental guidance and through elders is still something that is very, very essential. And then I think that it is of a great loss if that is not, if that is being dismantled. I think children still need certain kind of like guidance through their formative years, even after they grow up, right? There are a lot of studies that shows that how living, for example, having the presence of the elders, even in one's later lives, like benefits one's kind of like development, and in terms of like social support and so on and so forth, right? So I think that there are a lot that we can glean from, and we can garner from leading, having peer learning and so on. This is something that we encourage at the university, learning from one's peers and so on. But this cannot be at the expense, I feel, of learning from elders, from scholars, right? From esteemed kind of like authorities, or in terms of like validating certain kind of like ideas, and helping you kind of nurture the ideas that you have in your mind, and to kind of like guide the young in order to develop their ideas into fruition. I think we need that kind of like a system.
Right. I mean, I think so. This is maybe a difference between an ummatic sort of vision of pop culture and perhaps a less sort of a more unconstrained Western sort of like just path of self-discovery. You can disregard what the older generation has said, and I suppose this is the difference between a kind of a tradition that looks to important references in the past, particularly the Quran and Sunnah. I mean, I wonder whether there's also something that we can draw on in this case with, as you suggested, like the studies which indicate that potential harms of social media, which currently I think we're going through a transition where there will probably end up being more regulatory oversight over social media companies, particularly for under 16s, because these devices are designed to be basically addictive, and the brain development of young people in their teens is not mature enough to be able to handle that. Whereas I think some of the studies indicate that the prefrontal cortex and the full sort of moral compass develops well into one's mid-20s or something along those lines. So I think very, very good advice overall. I wanted to actually point out two questions that have arisen, and this is linked to something that I was myself taking a note on when you were giving your presentation. So one is, if you think about the way in which these media industries operate in the West, they are often coupled with very pathological tendencies as well. So how do we think about the fact that in the context of global neoliberalism, the commodification of things like sexuality is part of this, and sometimes it manifests in very problematic ways. Right now in hip hop, there are major sort of scandals taking place, whether it's major figures are being accused of being engaged in all sorts of perversions, And that's not to even speak of the sorts of things which might be considered normal in these cultures, but which Muslims would consider to be perversions of normal healthy sexuality. I also recently watched a fascinating film. I don't know if you've come across American Fiction. I forget the name of the, but the way in which the suffering of, in that particular case, African Americans is commodified for the consumption of white people, effectively. So, a famous in the story, a famous black author who writes very highbrow intellectual kind of novels is frustrated because their publisher is not interested in their next work. So they write something which is, he pretends to be someone who came out of the ghetto and lived there, and he writes in a sort of like very the grammar is poor, and he's talking about drugs and criminality and those sorts of things, and it becomes a bestseller. And it's a really wonderful comedy, American Fiction, probably in line for a number of awards. But the way in which everything gets swallowed up by neoliberalism, in a sense, in that particular instance, the author is concerned about, how am I going to pay for my elderly mother's end of life care, so I just need to do this just to make the money, even though I believe in none of it whatsoever. And he ultimately sort of does, you could argue, succumb to the temptation of just going after the money, even though it means he's perpetuating this kind of white gaze on the African American community. So just some reflections on serious problems in pop culture in particular, but and how we navigate that sort of a situation as Muslims, thinking ummatically.
First off, I'm definitely not. It's not my intention here to kind of like say that everything is fine, and then with hip hop, and when we talk about hip hop in general, that there are no problems within hip hop. The problems within hip hop has been, I think, is well traversed. We all know about the misogyny, the hypersexualization, drugs, violence, and stuff like that, right? So what for example, what kind of like led me to a study of like a hip hop culture is, I see young Muslims trying to kind of like harness the potency of hip hop and try to bring it closer to their own kind of piety, right? And what they and to also use its potency to as a platform for social activism. So, for example, I started off studying, for example, during my postgraduate years, my master's thesis was on Muslim leaders, right? The Muslim elites, right? But then I kind of get a little bit disillusioned with this kind of like a study of elites, because what we get from them is basically kind of like a quotable quotes from newspapers and stuff, like sanitized kind of comments, like you see that leaders kind of like tread on eggshells when we get politically kind of correct statements. But that was why when I switched to studying in the youth, then I find that a lot of the youth, they are at the front of a lot of this conversation that we have with regard to our kind of like Muslim community. Like, for example, they are the ones who are unabashedly like kind of like talking about like issues of Islamophobia, issues of discrimination, and so on. So granted, right, there are a lot of like problems within, and as parents and all that, I think that it is our duty to kind of like just now we say that the influence of elders, and about providing making sure young people have strong grounding, right, in Islamic kind of principles, and in order to guide their actions moving forward. So I think that this has to be done, right? I don't know, my own approach like is that we shouldn't kind of like we should I think tell the student tell the children that, for example, the young Muslims, right, like for example, I think a lot of young Muslims, they know, for example, right, what are the negatives and positives of this particular culture. So I get a lot of like I read a lot of interviews whereby young Muslims are talking about how they are how They are just basically taking the essence of a particular kind of culture, devoid of all its of its negative connotations, and using that as a kind of art form. So, for example, young Muslims are talking about how, for example, the Quran itself, right, is um, uh, uh, given to people, right? For example, the Quran is a divine revelation that is of an exalted kind of prose. So a lot of hip hoppers, when they speak, they see hip hop as being of a similar kind of a tradition in terms of rhyming, in terms of poetry, and so on. So I think that there's a particular interview by Swan Abdul Khabir with one of the rappers, Napoleon, whereby Napoleon mentioned that um, Moses, I think, yeah, I think Muhammad came like with poetry, right? And then they see themselves as like the progenies of the prophet, right? That each prophet came to a particular kind of community with tools that the community will be able to understand, or values that they put as values to aspire to. So there are a lot of and I think that we have to tap on some of the these conversations, right? And see where we can improve certain kind of ways whereby we are engaging the youth. I kind of what was the question that you mentioned?
So, I mean, I think it was an amalgamation of a couple of questions, but
Yeah.
I actually have kind of lost that particular question. I mean, it was along the lines of, you know, how do Muslims participate in this sort of space while limiting its more sort of pathological or problematic dimensions? Um, and I think you've done a good deal to sort of like reflect on the various challenges, particularly young people might face when it comes to navigating this space. But I think in some respects, those challenges are endemic to the human condition. Like
Yeah.
being human means you need to ask these constant sort of you constantly need to make the assessment. The on American Christians sometimes ask, "What would Jesus do?" Right? In the same way, the Muslim asks, what would the Prophet do in this
Yeah.
sort of situation? What would he advise? And this is something that every Muslim has to engage in throughout their lives. I mean, just to link it to another question that's being asked, and you mentioned the importance of scholars. You don't just, you're not just learning from pop culture. That's not your source of,
Mhm.
ultimate guidance. But I think what your message seems to be is that this is a very important medium of communication on a wide scale,
Yeah.
and you also indicated that poetry, hip hop culture is particularly interesting because in the Islamic tradition you had Jahili poetry, so pre-Islamic poetry, which is interesting because at times it was very problematic from an Islamic perspective.
Yeah.
It carried the culture of Jahiliyyah at times. And yet, it was seen as obligatory for people to study it, including, the companions of the Prophet would emphasize the study of it because without it, you wouldn't be able to appreciate the brilliance of the Quran as a linguistic miracle from Allah Subhanahu wa Taala. So, I think you made that point quite powerfully as well.
Yeah.
I think there are some scholars, I haven't seen the literature, but I know there's at least one master's degree in London where someone compared some Jahili poets to contemporary hip hop artists because they have similar sort of tropes of,
Yeah.
in some respects, tropes of indecency, talking about, the misogyny and various other sort of but at the same time, the Quran is a challenge to that on a linguistic level. And recently, you mentioned in the introduction of representing Islam the fact that Kendrick Lamar won a Pulitzer Prize for
Yeah.
his album, Dam, I think it's called. And this is, one of the, he is seen as a great artist in terms of his literary productions. I'm not someone myself who is a consumer of hip hop, so I can't
Yeah.
really necessarily appreciate this. But sometimes I will go on YouTube and look at sort of like analyses of these people's poetry, and it is extremely complex, and it's a very
Yeah.
significant art form, and that's why it has a massive reach. So
Yeah.
in this connection, I mean, like someone had a question, and I think to a certain extent, um, you've addressed some of these, but perhaps I can sort of like direct the question more explicitly. Someone asks, how important are Pakistani and Turkish film industries in the Ummatic process? So, we talked about Hollywood, but you also mentioned the idea that scholars need to be engaged. I was just thinking about, Yusuf al-Qaradawi,
Mm.
who's a late scholar from Egypt, was involved in a series from about a decade and a half ago, or a decade ago, called Omar, produced by NBC. It was a 30 part Ramadan series, which was, at the time that it was produced, the most expensive sort of like series production with, I don't know, tens of thousands of extras that had ever been produced. And Salman al-Auda and some other sort of like very well respected but publicly known scholars were
Yeah.
contributing to that. And I wonder, and there was actually a rumor in the late 2000s that the Qataris had allocated a significant budget and brought in some of the producers of the Matrix films and the Lord of the Rings franchise to
Yeah.
try to produce a film of the Prophet Muhammad. And I wonder to what extent you may be familiar with some of these, and to what extent, what is the significance of doing something like this in your view?
Yeah, I'm certainly out of my depth in talking about the Pakistani or the Turkish film industries, but I think that there are, if we as an ummah, as a Muslim ummah, feel that there are certain kind of like positives in front in putting certain kind of like championing certain kind of like movies or something like that, and making it wide scale. I think that we should definitely kind of like, there are ways in today's kind of like society in order to put that content out. I
Right.
think if you look at alternatives, like ways of doing stuff, right? One of the ways whereby we can look at certain an example that is very important. I feel that in my upcoming work on football is that
Mm.
you look at the Qatar World Cup, right? And we look at all the other. I don't know whether you watch soccer yourself, but
Yes.
if you look at all the other kind of installation of like the of World Cups, right? And you look at
Right.
how the Qataris, you mentioned just now how the Qataris are spending lots of money, right? And how they have spent money to host the Qatar World Cup ever
Right.
since the opening ceremony, right?
Right.
You look at there are a lot of messages of da'wah. There are a lot of like hadiths that are being kind of like brought forth to for the world, showing the beauty of Islam, a lot of
Right.
Quranic verses and all that
Yeah.
kind of stuff. So I think that if there is political will, right, there is
Yeah.
certainly there are certainly examples out there of
Right.
Muslim countries, like a Muslim kind of like social groups, institutions, doing a lot of good, like in
Right.
terms of like providing some of these alternatives that advance the Ummatic kind of like agenda.
Right, right. And I think, I mean, Qatar is a fascinating example because it's a tiny country. It's,
Yeah.
maybe 2, 3 million people, a vast majority of whom are expatriates. And although it's a, inordinately wealthy country, so that's why it has the resources in some respects, and lesser constraints, because large countries with large populations also have popular demands domestically. So the Qatari royal family probably has fewer constraints than most people with as much money as they have. But what's interesting in the West, of course, is there is widespread Islamophobia as well, and so the focus in many Western contexts when it came to the Qatari World Cup was to try and focus on, for example, problems that might have arisen, significant, in their estimation, significant waste of money and the like.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
because the Qatari World Cup was arguably the most expensive World Cup in the history of the World Cup. Yet, if it's seen as an investment for the global understanding of Islam, then presumably it is actually not just a legitimate Ummatic project, but it's a desirable Ummatic project. So there are questions, and may Allah guide Muslim rulers in our own time to spend money in those ways. Someone comments, Mark Johnston says that Turkish soaps are particularly popular in the Gulf. Now, I mean, you may be familiar with the Ertugrul series, but I think most Turkish soap operas are quite different to Ertugrul in flavor. They're quite secular and worldly in their orientation. And so someone is asking about how a particular Bollywood actress, because there are Muslim Bollywood actresses who are apparently, I don't know enough about Bollywood, and I would suspect that based on what you said earlier, that you might not be entirely comfortable talking about specific actresses, but they're asking how can these Muslim actresses, and there are Muslims, there are plenty of Muslims in Bollywood, but there are Muslims and then there are Muslims, so to speak, right? There are Muslims who are interested in their Islamic identity, and there are Muslims who are Muslims primarily in name. And so I wonder if you have any comment. This is someone who's put the question again: do these people have anything to contribute to Ummatic pop culture in your view?
I think that everyone potentially has a potential, right? To advance like a certain kind of worldview. If and in every particular industry we see examples of this. Like for example, in my current study of football, of course, I picked out names like just now, like Paul Pogba or N'Golo Kante or Karim Benzema and Mohamed Salah and stuff like that. But there are loads of other footballers that do not want to participate in some of this like identity politics, right? So I'm sure that in Bollywood or whatever kind of industries we can pick names like this, right? So but what I want to like kind of highlight, like for example, this issue of kind of like there are a lot of youth who are watching a lot of these popular cultural icons. For example, I was looking at Karim Benzema just putting like a post on one date and a glass of milk, and say Ramadan Mubarak or something like that, and 5 million or like and a lot of them 5 million like kind of likes, and a lot of Muslims are very happy to see themselves represented, are happy to see like some of the people that they look up to like kind of like flaunt their Islamic identity.
Right.
I'm sure that there are a lot of, and this we can see that these are very small kind of like actions, but they highlight kind of like the beauty of Islam, for example. Maybe for Muslims we take this to be taken for granted, right? Yeah, but I'm not sure within the context of the larger global society and all that. Yeah, because I've read kind of like I don't want to make too big a deal out of it, but I've read kind of like interviews whereby people kind of like embrace Islam and all that because of like some of this like
Mohamed Salah in the UK and in Liverpool does seem to have a bit of a reputation in sort of inspiring that sort of shift. I mean, I think there's a saying, I don't know if there's a hadith, that لا تنكر من الأعمال شيئا, don't belittle any of your works. And what's really interesting is those of us who live in sort of relatively cosmopolitan Islamic environments. You're in Singapore. I mean, like, I don't say this too ironically, but I'm in Amsterdam, which is like, something like 10-15% Muslim. London's another of these kind of global cities, which there are neighborhoods which are just so Muslim. So it's about 15% Muslim or so. And so, for us, it may be that we have these vibrant Islamic sort of contexts in which we can participate. But, as my colleague and someone who has also very kindly contributed to the Ummatics Colloquium, Yahya Burt, in his 2022 report, I believe, he has a report called Ummah at the Margins. He points out around a quarter of the Ummah lives in minority contexts, and very often these are people who live very isolated. And so, that sort of symbolism is, I think so incredibly important. Sometimes, some of the people that you mentioned might not be particularly exemplary Muslims, right?
Yep.
Particularly, the life on the football pitch and life in popular culture doesn't necessarily lend itself to that. But at the same time, you have the famous hadith in Bukhari that this is in Bukhari, so I just don't criticize me for the language the Prophet ﷺ uses, but a prostitute was forgiven for feeding a cat, right? And so little actions can overcome great sin, and so those sorts of things have to be borne in mind. I think when assessing the positive impact of something like social media in the way that you've indicated, I think extremely important. Yeah, a lot of very interesting commentary. I'm not sure. I don't believe I know Mark Johnston personally, but he's pointing out Mustafa Aqad or Aqad, the famous Egyptian director. He was also famous as a horror movie director in Hollywood, but he has two well-known biographical films, Lion of the Desert, about Umar Mukhtar and the Libyan liberation, and The Message, about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And these were fantastically important pieces of cinema. They had, I think, a very significant impact for many years. And to a certain extent, it's, he was obviously a very brilliant director himself and proved himself throughout his life. But at the same time, the fact that there are so few of these that we can identify them and immediately recognize them as, oh, that was, the production of, of a major Muslim film, is, I think, and we can only count these on, perhaps one hand, I think is a bit of an indictment of the sort of condition of Muslim or Islamic production. I wanted to ask, this is something which has already been kind of signaled at, and I've already kind of indicated this, but it seems that to produce the kind of scale of Hollywood or Bollywood, and increasingly China's now participating, they've spent enormous amounts of money in this arena, and they already fund like major Hollywood projects. My question, I suppose, is, how do you compete as a sort of broken up ummah in more than 50 countries with these superpowers, effectively? Do you not need the economics of that and the scale of that sort of country or economy to be able to do this? And I wonder if you have any reflections and thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think as Muslims are right now, right? I think it is difficult for us to envision kind of like a particular country in its current state to kind of come forth with a particular industry that is able to give a satisfactory scene as that promotes the Muslim Ummah, a portrayal of the Muslim Ummah as something that we will all like it to be, right? I think as it stands right now, it needs kind of like a transnational kind of effort and collective in that sense, like like-minded kind of like Muslims from across like regions to come together to for something, for an effort like this.
Right.
Yeah.
I agree. I think to a certain extent, this is kind of like the raison d'etre of Ummatics as a project, because we recognize that divided we fall in this way. And so there needs to be kind of a systematic effort to try and realize greater unity of purpose within the Ummah. And that will, inshallah, make it sort of more possible for these sorts of things to emerge. So there are lots of comments and questions, and we apologize in advance that we have relatively limited time, and roughly another 20 minutes or so, inshallah, of your time, Dr. Kamal. It's really been, I think, a very fruitful conversation so far. There are so many dimensions of this that we can explore. And I had some questions of my own, of course, which I haven't completely exhausted yet. So I hope that's. I'm going to come back to viewers' questions in a moment, inshallah. But I'm just actually going to, as I gather my thoughts, or sort of organize the viewers' questions better. I wanted to quickly draw on, one of the questions that I had written elsewhere or noted down, to a comment that you made somewhat earlier on, which is the question of center periphery, and I wonder, because you also commented on the importance of referencing authoritative sources of knowledge alongside our exposure to popular culture, and the paradigms with which you introduce yourself as a sociologist, the paradigms with which we operate within modern scholarship, and this is something that I think Ummatics does spend some time reflecting on. These are, as Deepa Chakrabarti notes in Provincializing Europe, the product of European thinking of the last 200 years or so. Like, this is the social sciences are not possible without the Enlightenment and all of these sorts of things coming together. But they are, of course, produced in a very particular context, and they have severe limitations when the analysis is taken abroad. And so I wonder, I mean, I really admire the work of scholars like Armando Salvatore, who are trying to kind of, in a sense, read the Islamic tradition and glean from it sociological concepts so that can then be sort of deployed. And I think increasingly there is the possibility of scholars doing that. But I wonder if you want to maybe reflect on the limitations of the sociological tools that we are utilizing. And I read you in the, unfortunately I've not read all of your books, you have a lot of writing, mashallah, but I read you as a descriptive sociologist primarily. And I think sociology is, it presents itself as a descriptive, and the social sciences generally as a descriptive enterprise, but with these Eurocentric underpinnings that are beginning to be critiqued by scholars, should we be somewhat concerned that our analysis smuggles in too much Eurocentric baggage as well, and it might do us a disservice? So, I mean, that's one dimension of the question, and you've kind of answered the second dimension of the question, that, as I'd noted it down, kind of the distinction between elite and popular normativity, because I think, and you could argue this could perhaps extend to center and periphery, because we do have certain authoritative reference sources. I just quoted a hadith from the Prophet. We have the Quran. But how do we navigate that, negotiate that? Because I think the center periphery sort of critique emerges in a context where the center is hegemonic surely because of accidents of history, whereas we can argue that a certain type of centralization of the Quran and Sunnah is essential to what we do as Muslims. Does that, I hope that sort of like isn't too long-winded a question.
Yeah. I think I'll kind of like tackle the center periphery kind of like a question first, and then after that I'll move to the question about Western kind of like a social science and how it impacts us. So for my book, for example, I just reference my particular work on from where I've like kind of argued my case in representing Islam. I feel that it is important for us to provincialize kind of like Islam, like from a particular kind of geographical space, as in to include kind of like other kind of like Muslim spaces and bring them into the fold, and see whether it is, to me, in essence, a more Ummatic kind of like approach, right? To have the Ummah kind of like get into conversations with one another,
right.
and then not have that kind of like a center periphery kind of like struggle whereby we see one place as being more kind of like privileged than others, one as being more authentic than others, like as from we can learn from one another, like
Right.
there are many kind of experts in the field that are dispersed around the world, right? And there are many important kind of like books that we can reckon with. Some of them have not even been translated into Islam. Sorry, has not been translated into English or even into Arabic. So we one of the work that we need to do, I think, is to bring a lot of these works into the center, right? So this center periphery,
the ostensible center, the ostensible center.
The ostensible center. Yeah. So similarly, like for example, in representing Islam, I also talk about not just provincializing Islam, but provincializing hip hop culture, like not just taking the US hip hop scene as the center of it all.
Right.
Like,
Right.
for example, when we talk about Muslim hip hop, Muslims, for example, in the Middle East are doing something with hip hop culture. Muslims in Europe are doing something with hip hop culture.
Right.
That
Right.
the notes, like I was mentioned, the matrices of power have kind of been dispersed. Like sometimes hip hoppers in Southeast Asia are looking towards Muslim hip hoppers in Sweden for inspiration rather than the US. Right?
Right.
So it is more complex and sophisticated. So that was what
Right.
I mean by kind of like dismantling this kind of like center periphery relations.
Right. Right. Right.
Not, like I said, privileging a particular space when we when we do social science, and I think that kind of like um, having that kind of mindset kind of impedes us, right? And also it relates back to the second question about social science, right?
Right.
About
Right.
I too like the works of, like what you mentioned, Armando Salvatore and stuff.
Right.
I had the good fortune of Armando kind of like endorsing my Globalized Muslim Youth book. I like his work on the sociology of Islam, and
Right.
and I totally agree with you about the problems of like uh, appropriating and ingesting concepts from the Western world unproblematically.
Right.
So, for example, if I can share with you, like my next project after I finish, inshallah, this book on
Sure.
football and Islam
Yeah.
in a few months, is to work on a project on religion and social theory, because
Okay.
I think that it is important for us to engage theoretical concepts,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I feel that a lot of uh, um, contemporary social theorists, when they engage with Islam and they engage with Muslim classical thinkers, we are just talking like over each other's head. There's no kind of engagement. For example, Muslim social theorists, classical thinkers have also engaged in concepts such as governance, right? Such as like generations, right? Such as social class, right? Such as social inequalities and different kinds of social inequalities. So I feel that there is a need for us, I think, especially as Muslims, right, to engage also at the conceptual and at the theoretical level, right? And not just like you mentioned just now as being like merely descriptive, like looking
Right.
at certain case studies and then seeing how Muslims are doing, what Muslims are doing in particular spheres and fields. I think at
Right.
the more kind of like a meta level, at the more theoretical level, we have to iron out some of these chinks and these issues.
Jazakumullah khair. Really, kind of, that's a very, I think, a broad answer to a broad question, but an answer with a sufficient specificity for us to go and sort of try and do something about it. I really look forward to, I mean, the book on religion and social theory, from it. I mean, bringing an Islamic pair of eyes. I mean, I saw you acknowledge Brian Turner, who I think you know personally,
Yeah, yeah,
who's one of the sort of like major authors in this area, obviously. But yeah, I think that kind of awaits to be done. I mean, obviously, scholars like Tara Asad in some respects adjacent fields have been doing this, but I kind of still wait for that kind of very substantial synthesis that brings to, tries to provincialize current sort of Eurocentric paradigms within the study of religion. It's been happening for a long time, but I think social theory in some respects needs a kind of Islamic perspective as well. And I wonder, so there's a whole movement, perhaps you can comment briefly on this as well, that there's a whole movement of decolonizing
yeah, yeah.
social sciences. And a lot of this, of course, takes inspiration from things like the Bandung Conference and the Global South as a unifying a project of its own, or counter-hegemonic project. But in some respects, I think, and I suspect my colleagues at Ummatics would share my thinking on some of this. I haven't had the opportunity to discuss it in detail, but we can seek sort of global South solidarities. But I also think there needs to be the articulation of Islamic solidarity as an Islamic project, or Islamic social science. The fact that I have to say Islamic social science is part of the problem, right?
Yeah.
And when you say social science, it is the Eurocentric paradigms, which are now being chipped away at by scholars like yourself and others. But I think the Islamic articulation of that, which requires the synthesis of vast traditions of knowledge in two different civilizational paradigms is yet to be done in any in a compelling way, and I hope that an upcoming generation of scholars can take on that challenge.
Yeah. It is important, Usama, for like, I think this is not a one man. I think I don't envision it as being a one man project. As in, we need a whole generation of scholars to consciously and deliberately work on engaging some of these um, uh, heuristic tools in order to kind of like be able to capture the complexities of our society
Absolutely.
accurately, right? Because that is like that is the aim of our job as social scientists, to be able to arrive at some sort of truth, right? So yeah.
And we can take inspiration from the fact that, like, basically we're calling for a generation of Ibn Khalduns, right? So we can take inspiration from the fact that we have a rich tradition of doing this, going back to a figure as early as Ibn Khaldun as a pioneering figure. Sadly, not many people followed in his footsteps, shall we say, within our tradition, but that can change significantly. Mark Johnston writes a nice comment on decolonization: knowledge is the lost property of the believer. So, al-hikmatu dallatul mu'min, as is narrated in a hadith with some weakness, but generally sound in its purport. I wanted to also highlight, if we have about 10 minutes, so maybe these will be the last two questions, but if anyone has any last questions, actually, so let me see if I can wrap up three questions, so to speak. So someone asks, Muhammad Salah, or Mo Salah as he's known, is an interesting case. Once he got famous, he shied away from supporting the Palestinian cause. Is this a pattern you noticed, and what are the reasons for it? And there are some people who are willing to really put their careers on the line. Mesut Ozil did this, but in a sense, as a result of doing that, his time in the limelight has diminished. Mohamed Salah, on the other hand, I don't know. I mean, he's not been particularly sort of like vocal, for example, on this issue. You have people like the great cricketer in the UK, Moeen, I forget his full name, but I think he's recently retired as well. So, as someone who follows these sorts of figures, how do you analyze that sort of choice that these people may make?
I think that we all are aware that people are rational actors, right? So they work under kind of like constraints that are for example, you mentioned, and in my upcoming book, I think Mesut Ozil, I think he features quite prominently in the book because of his social activism, and what are the costs of championing certain kind of like Muslim causes and so on, right? I look at it like what you mentioned just now. Like, for example, it is difficult to find a perfect human being. In fact, we cannot find one. Like, we cannot expect somebody to say to do everything and encapsulate all the. We have a lot of battles that we are to fight, right?
After the prophet. No perfect human after the prophet.
Pardon?
No perfect human being after the Prophet ﷺ.
MashaAllah. There's no kind of like human being amongst us, right? So I think that we can be critical of certain actions, like and also being aware of the positives that person has done towards advancing the consensus of the Muslim Ummah, right? For example, and I document, for example, in if talking about football, like over the last like a few years, you can see, for example, during the fasting in Ramadan in the UK, from before fasting was done in a very covert manner, right? And Muslim players kind of hide their fast in order to have some game time. But today, even during the heat of the game can be stopped, so that Muslim players are able to break their fast. So there are certain kind of developments and certain kind of like I feel it's easy, and it is like because today we're living in a world whereby Muslims are where we are today in terms of like um, um, the balance of power, to be kind of like depressed and be very disillusioned with what's going on. But with I take some solace in some of these developments, right? Whereby certain kinds of da'wah, certain kinds of like actions are leading to certain kinds of awareness
Right.
in this particular fraternities and species.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there are reasons for optimism. There are obviously, I mean, we're living through a genocide right now within a section of our ummah, at the heart of our ummah, of course, and the killing of potentially hundreds of thousands of people right now. And yet, these are things which, alongside that, we are the largest the ummah has ever been, and potentially the largest it's ever been as a proportion of humanity as well. And that's increasing. And so, there are opportunities, there are plenty of threats, and it's a question of how we balance those considerations. I think this is likely to be. I think it's. I mean, it's a question, but I'll maybe amalgamate this and a couple of other questions. So Rahila asks, and it's a bit of a comment as well. Maybe more of a comment. Muslims should boycott, major media houses like Hollywood and Bollywood if they haven't already. Hollywood is losing credibility now, not just with Muslims but non-Muslims, because of its staunch pro-Israeli stance, its problematic scandals, referring to the Weinsteins and these sorts of people, and the lack of imagination. I mean, there's kind of a bit of a superhero crisis at the moment in the realms of Hollywood, and I wonder. I mean, like, this is a sentiment that you'll find among certain Muslims, that these should just be boycotted. And so, as someone who studies sort of popular culture, I always feel that this is something which maybe Muslim elites can aspire to, but it's never really going to have that same impact. At least this is how I feel, among the masses who are kind of going to by default be consumers of this sort of material. So I wonder, if you have any thoughts on, Mark Johnston adds, popular media reflects and shapes culture symbiotically. The beat poets in America are a recent example. This creates a channel or a current. Where do you see these currents appearing today? So that's another question which is more direct about popular culture. But I also wonder whether it's, is boycotting, effective? It's been massively effective in the context of the Gaza war against certain types of groups. Starbucks, McDonald's have seen major declines in their sales. But things like Hollywood, which are just as instrumental in perpetuating this kind of genocidal mania within contemporary liberalism. I wonder if you have any thoughts on those two questions, inshallah.
Yeah, I've studied, like I was
and any
mentioning.
concluding thoughts. And any concluding thoughts, sorry.
Yeah, okay. Like I mentioned just now during the talk, I've have written a few pieces on boycotts as moral protests, right? So I document, for example, Muslim views on boycotts. For example, even on Starbucks and McDonald's and stuff like that, the diverse views the Muslims hold on whether to boycott or not, whether this tradition is steeped in the actions of the Prophet, or is this something that we need to do now given the current times. So this is I think a question that we need to have like with, within our community, right? I think that the BDS movement has been able to garner kind of some kind of support to especially now, but like with every boycott movement, with the downturn of that particular event that kind of spark off this boycott, like sometimes boycotts kind of wane, right, in terms of subscription, in terms of will. So we need to think about not just, I feel, to have like a boycott, but to come out like for example, come out with viable alternatives, like you just like a lot of the comments have just mentioned, right? In order to fill this void, this vacuum, Like after we boycott, then what? Right. So some of the Muslims are also talking about this at a more kind of concrete level. Like then who should we do? The question then. What I was mentioning just now also about another article that I wrote on Muslim consumer ethics, and Islamic revivalism, as in,
Right.
after, for example, boycotting is one aspect of it, but then who then should we support, right?
Right.
Ethically as Muslims,
Right.
right? And this goes beyond a kind of a halal consciousness of whether this product is halal or not, because it takes into account a kind of like a geopolitical mapping of what is going on with regard to fairness and justice and welfare.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. No, Jazakumullah khairan. I mean, yeah, this is as actually a colleague, Mark Johnston again notes, boycotts raise awareness to specific problems, but don't necessarily lead to change. And I think, as you say, that there will be different positions, and people also feel a kind of moral duty. Chris Hedges, in the context of the Gaza genocide. And he's been a long-term friend of Muslims and the downtrodden, was saying that given the context of the genocide, we should under no circumstances vote for the Democrat Party. I mean, those who are American based in the US. Regardless of the fact that people are saying, oh, you're going to let in sort of a worse kind of alternative. I think there's a moral argument to be made there for that stance. I really appreciate the past 2 hours that you've given us to mull over these very sort of fascinating and important questions from an Ummatics perspective in particular. And I'm glad that you kind of went over your own past work and reflected on the way in which you've actually been citing the Ummah throughout. I think this is something which is very organically present within scholars within the Ummah. We kind of automatically think in those terms, but now we're starting to articulate it, I think, more explicitly. And I look forward to us staying in touch, not just me and you individually, but as with the Ummatics Institute. Your own work, I think, is going to be quite relevant to us thinking about popular outreach within Ummatics Institute itself. But with that, I'd like to conclude by thanking you for really giving 2 hours of your time and so much, rich material for us to reflect on. And also, of course, to all the audience members who've been participating. Sorry we couldn't get to all of your questions and comments, but I think we had a very engaging couple of hours. With that, I will bring this session to a close. Inshallah. Jazakumullah khairan. And سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.